might seem crazy what I'm about to say. Sunshine, she's here, you can take a break.
Welcome to this tutorial on what I like to call happy tones. Yeah, I know. It's my best attempt at some really good humor here. So anyways, happy tones are all about how we analyze primary source documents. So big thing for me whenever I look at anything in history to explain to students is, why are we doing this? Like, what's the significance? Why do we have to look at documents, especially documents that come from the past? Here's why I think, and I'm going to actually give you 3 big reasons why I think we should analyze documents from the past. Number 1, it gives us the point of view of the people during the time we're studying. The reason why this is so important is that the people who are at that time period are not us, and we really need to recognize that. It really doesn't matter if the people come from a different country, a different ethnicity, a different gender. They could come from the same place we live in. If they come from a different time period, they're coming from a different point of view. Which brings me up to reason number 2. And this actually comes from a guy named Sam Weinberg, who is a professor at Stanford University. And he actually wrote a book called History and Other Unnatural Acts. So what does that mean? What Sam Weinberg was talking about is that it's natural for us to think that everybody else around us is exactly like us. And this is the big mistake students make when they study history. They look back in the past and say, I get it. All those mistakes that happened in the past, we're learning from them, right? Well, sorta. We learn from them. Big thing for me whenever I look at anything in history to explain to students is, why are we doing this? Like, what's the significance? Why do we have to look at documents, especially documents that come from the past? Here's why I think, and I'm going to actually give you 3 big reasons why I think we should analyze documents from the past. Number 1, it gives us the point of view of the people during the time we're studying. The reason why this is so important is that the people who are at that time period are not us, and we really need to recognize that. It really doesn't matter if the people come from a different country, a different ethnicity, a different gender. They could come from the same place we live in. If they come from a different time period, they're coming from a different point of view. Which brings me up to reason number 2. And this actually comes from a guy named Sam Weinberg, who is a professor at Stanford University. And he actually wrote a book called History and Other Unnatural Acts. So what does that mean? What Sam Weinberg was talking about is that it's natural for us to think that everybody else around us is exactly like us. And this is the big mistake students make when they study history. They look back in the past and say, I get it. All those mistakes that happened in the past, we're learning from them, right? Well, sorta. We do learn from them, there's no question about that, but we don't learn from them in quite the way that you might think. The mistakes of the past really don't happen today. Why? Because the context and the details of the past were different. When we study history, we're trying to figure out how the people of that time period are really not like us. They have a different way of looking at the world because they live in a different time period with a different world. Which brings me up to reason number 3. Reason number 3, I want you to see history as like a time machine. Whenever we get into a textbook, a primary source, secondary source, whatever, we're getting into a time machine and we're going back to the past and we're trying to understand how people lived in another time and in another context. That means I want you to see history as like learning a foreign language or learning a different culture. In the end, history is all about one big word, context. So because of that, I want to give you a strategy on how to do this, and it's called happy tones. So here's how that works for happy tones. Let's start off with H. H is historical context. So I like to call this the Bruce rule. Don't know why, honestly. So there was a teacher out there who told me this rule and I can't remember his name, so I just call him Bruce. I'm not quite sure why. Here's the idea of the Bruce rule. If something you come up with can be said for any time period, you have violated the Bruce rule. The idea of the Bruce rule is this: we've got to make whatever analysis we have specific to the time period we're studying. Give you an example. If we're studying about the origins of Islam and the expansion of Islam, the tendency a lot of students are going to have is to say, oh yeah, I get it. It's the religion of Islam, right? So we see terrorism happening in the world in the Middle East, and we want to start applying all the things that we can think about with terrorism in the Middle East and Islam and violence today and the conflicts with Islam See, that's got to be the exact same thing that was going on from the beginning. Well, it was not. Actually, if we look back to the beginnings of Islam, what we see is that Islam was really complicated. It was actually a peaceful religion, and it could be a violent religion. It depended upon the region, and that was true of any religion at this time. Why? Because Islam primarily dealt with other people through trade and was therefore peaceful. At the same time, Islam had a lot of conflicts within, like between Shias and Sunnis. Because of that, there were internal conflicts of violence between sects of Islam. In order to understand a time period, we really have to understand its historical context. What was unique? What was going on at that time period? Okay. Next part of Happy Tones is A, the audience. Who is the author writing to? Because that can definitely change our message. And we know that, right? I mean, if you're talking to your parents, you're going to talk in one way. If you give that same message to your friends, you're probably going to change the way you sound, the rhetoric you use, and the purpose that you have, because you have a different audience. And that's true of authors as well. Authors who make documents have different audiences, and they have different intentions for those audiences.
Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do.
So now let's move on to P, the point of view. So whenever I ask who wrote a document from here on out, I don't want you saying the name of the person. I know the name of the person. It's written down on the paper. What I'm looking for is their social position, their societal status, hierarchy, class, gender, ethnicity, national origins. Why are we doing this? Well, because we want to figure out how a person's social status affected their viewpoint. I'll give you an example. One of the biggest Islamic explorers and leaders of early Islam was a man named Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta traveled throughout what's called Afro-Eurasia, Africa, Europe, and Asia. He traveled throughout all of the Islamic empires. At one point, he ended up getting out to Africa, where he described Islam. And he said a lot of really positive things about African Muslims, but he also talked about them in very negative ways too. He didn't understand some of their practices. He saw them as being a little barbaric and not quite the way they were supposed to do things as far as Islam goes. Okay, so that's his point of view. Where is it coming from? Well, he was an upper class judge coming from a family in the Middle East. So when he got out to Africa, he sees them as different. How did the Africans view their practices? Probably really differently, because they had a different point of view. They had a social status, different region, different attitude towards things. Our point of view influences what we say. Okay. Next part of Happy Tones is why. Why did he write the document? So this could be either conscious or sometimes it's unconscious. They don't really know the agenda that they're getting across. It's something we have to do some interpretation about. This is where I want you to get beyond the literal statements that somebody's making and ask more about what's their purpose, what's their agenda. For example, take Ibn Battuta again. What was Ibn Battuta talking about when he was talking about all these horrible practices in Africa? Well, likelihood is he was trying to promote the superiority of Arab and Persian Islam over that of other practices of Islam around the world. Why? Because Ibn Battuta comes from the Middle East, where he was influenced by Arab and Persian Islam. Okay, last off is tones. What do I mean by tones? It's like in your English class. Analyze the rhetoric of the passage. Is it sarcastic? Is it critical? Is it optimistic? Etc., etc. The purpose of doing that is to give us a little bit more about the intended meaning and the audience of the passage. So like, for example, why did Ibn Battuta, why was he critical of African culture? What was the tone for? Well, there are a few possibilities. He could be admonishing local leaders, saying you'd better be better about your Islam. He could be warning Arabs and Persians back home, hey, be careful about these guys. They're not as good at Islam as you might think they are. So you want to try and take a look. What is the overall tone? That's going to tell you a little bit about the purpose and the agenda. Okay. What are our big takeaways from Happy Tones? When you are looking at documents this year, I don't want you to literally just spit back to me what they're saying. Instead, I want you to look at what's the source? What's the context? Number 2, ask about the point of view or the social place of the author. This really influences their overall agenda. And then number 3, now you go into the reading, get a gist of the reading, meaning getting an overall idea of it and its relationship to context. Because in the end, that's what we're doing in history. In history, we're asking, why does this happen at this time? And what was the purpose or function of why it was happening at this time? And that's going to get you to go beyond the superficial paraphrasing and summarizing. Okay, I'll see you in class.